Hello there and welcome. I am Larissa Vigue-Picard. I'm Executive Director at Pejepscot History Center here in Brunswick, Maine. And I thank you all for joining us today for the arrival of the Ulster-Scots in the Pejepscot region. We have 48 people who've registered for this program today, which is fantastic. 32 of whom are members, and so thank you so much for being members, 16 of whom are from the general public. And I always like to encourage those folks to consider membership. There are discounts on membership for all of our programs. Sometimes there's no membership fee at all for members. And so if you want to consider that, please know that later on I will put a link to our member page and donor page in the chat box. So, and we're also have just started running our annual funds, so that link will be in there too. This program today is under our 2022 theme of immigration, and that is immigration writ large. We are looking at the very beginning of people coming to this land and up through the present day. We had a wonderful program last month by Reza Jalali from the Portland Immigrant Center and legislator Morgan Rielly, authors of this wonderful book, if you do not know about it, talking about contemporary immigration to Maine. And so we really are going from the beginning to the present day as much as possible. Before we formally begin the program, I would like to just acknowledge that our properties here in Brunswick sit on the former lands of the ancestors of today's Wabanaki communities. And this is important at any time to acknowledge, but it's especially important to us this year as we do recognize, as we talk about the theme of immigration, and recognize that our region's very first immigrants, European settlers, some of whom we're going to be focusing on today, also became colonists in many cases. And just so we're all clear on that, and we'll continue to talk about this throughout the year, those two things are really not the same. Certainly contemporary immigration is very far from the idea of colonizing another people. And of course, the original inhabitants of the land were forever impacted, as were the people that arrived here. I also want to just say that it's difficult not to think of what's going on in the world in Ukraine, as well as we talk about immigration and people in that case being forced to flee their homeland. So just to acknowledge that sad note. As part of this focus on immigration, we have several other great programs coming up. I will put a link to that in the chat box as well. March 22nd is a fun evening on Zoom. It's like a history happy hour. It happens to be a very short annual business meeting, but we're going to also be doing some immigration history trivia. We'll be doing a live choose your own adventure walk through our collections and highlights of the past year. So I encourage you to consider attending that. That is by donation. March 27, we are beginning a spring and fall monthly book group on the subject of immigration. That will be listed on our events page as well. April 14th at 5:30 here at PHC, we are opening a small exhibit on the history of fishing in the Pejepscot region. And that same evening, we have a wonderful talk with Tom Santaguida, who is a longtime fisherman in this area and caterer. And he's going to talk about his own Italian family's immigration to this country and then to Maine. And then May 12th at 5:30, we have a program with Anna Faherty, who is the archivist for USM's Franco-American collection, and she's going to talk on the origins and cultural influence of French-Canadian immigration. So a lot of interesting things coming up. We are also working on immigration-related walking tours. over the summer, and we're working on our programming for the fall too. So stay tuned as far as that goes. All right, on to the program that you're here to enjoy today. I'll introduce our two speakers in the order that they're speaking, and then I will turn it over to our first speaker. And that first speaker will be John Mann, who is the founder and president emeritus of the Maine Ulster-Scots project. He is himself a descendant of Scots-Irish immigrants arriving in Maine on the Robert in 1718. John's a professional land surveyor, founder and president of Mann Associates, a firm with more than 4 decades of experience. And his work has primarily been within the Kennebec and Casco Bay settlement areas. John is the author of Ulster-Scots on the Coast of Maine, Volume 1. Ulster-Scots on the Coast of Maine, and then Volume 1, The Means Massacre Background and Location, and various articles. Most recently, he published a collection of short stories titled Side Shots, Stories of a Land Surveyor's Traverse Through the District of Maine, which I think must be quite fascinating. He's probably learned and seen a lot. Our second speaker today is Ian Saxine, who received his PhD from Northwestern University. Ian teaches US history and British Atlantic world history at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. His research focuses on colonial and Native American history, especially in New England. His first book, Properties of Empire, Indians, Colonists, and Land Speculators on the New England Frontier, was published in 2019. Ian was the project historian for the Eastham 400 program, re-examining the encounter between Wampanoag and Plymouth colonists on Cape Cod in 1620. And he hosts the podcast, Mainly History, which he and I were talking about a little bit, collaborating on, featuring conversations about Maine and New England in the past to better understand them in the present, which is certainly our mission with our programs today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to do the first portion of the program. And John, if you want to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now.
All right. Thank you very much, Larissa.
You are most welcome.
I'm going to try to get my screen up. I do wrong.
Screen share. And choose your program.
All right. Can you see my screen? Oh,
we sure can. Yep.
Oh, you can. And you
Yep.
can hear me.
Yeah.
We're up and going. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Got it.
Thanks to the Pejepscot Historical Society for inviting me to do this talk. And thanks to Ian for agreeing to do it with me. The program title was The Arrival of Ulster-Scots in the Pejepscot region. And Ulster-Scots is what we do with the Maine Ulster-Scots project. Our mission is to find and save and then share the stories of the Scots-Irish that came to Maine from 1718 to 1760. And the Ulster-Scots project was founded in 2006. And we are going to take a look first at the origin of the word Ulster-Scots because it tends to lead to some information which I think is important. The word Ulster, if you look it up in the we seem to be out of order. All right. Hang on a minute while I find my screen. Still out of order. All right. Don't know why either.
Two different presentations. You want to stop sharing?
Hang on, bear with me. Now we're going. Thank you.
And this is-
If you look up the word Ulster in the Wikipedia, you'll find a
John,
definition.
we still don't see anything.
Stop share there and then reopen it. Without the share, there we go. Got it.
No, it's not going to do it.
There we go.
Can you see that one?
Yes.
All right. Hopefully this will run smoothly now. Looks like it will. The Wikipedia defines Ulster as one of 4 traditional Irish provinces located in the north of Ireland. And this is important because Ireland, the north of Ireland province, has a history with Western Scotland, which goes back for centuries to the Kingdom of Dalriada. So there's a long-standing immigration and business and family connections that took place back and forth across the short distance between the north of Ireland and Scotland. The word Scot itself, according to Merriam-Webster, is a member of a Celtic people of Northern Ireland settling in Scotland about the year AD 500. Well, the Ulster-Scots that came to Maine may not have been all Celtic peoples, but they certainly share the common history from that region. And I thought it was important to start at least with a definition. The terminology that gets used by people in history and on the ground is wide and interesting, to say the least. But some people refer to them as the Irish, later Scotch-Irish, Scots-Irish, crackers, rednecks, hillbillies, God's frontiermen, and people with no name at all. But nonetheless, there are some 30 million Americans that trace their ancestry back to that group. Interestingly enough, in doing the research for starting up this program for the Ulster-Scots project back in 2006, we found the 2000 census showed that there were more people claiming Scottish ancestry in Maine than any other state in the Union. So I'm going to start with in my definition of these people and how they thought about themselves in their exodus from the north of Ireland and their arrival in Maine, using the words of Reverend Elijah Kellogg, who many of you are familiar with from the Kellogg Church in Harpswell, and perhaps from his writings of children's stories and novels, which were very popular in the second half of the 19th century. Using the words from Reverend Elijah Kellogg, he states, "They were called in that day Scotch-Irish, not that there was any mixture of blood, but a long residence in Ireland had given rise to the name. In the year 1608, by reason of the rebellion of the native chieftains of the north of Ireland and their subsequent defeat and banishment, about 500,000 acres accrued to the crown. That is, it became the property of the King of England. These lands James I settled to a great extent with immigrants from England and Scotland. Ireland had for ages been the back door to England and Scotland, through which the French had thrown forces into the kingdom and aided the cause of insurrection. Therefore, as a bulwark against future aggression, James determined to drive out the native Catholic Irish and to replace them largely by a Protestant population of Scotch and English, but principally Scotch, rough-handed and warlike, those whose lands were to be given them in fee simple on certain conditions, and who might be safely counted upon to defend their property to the death. It was supposed they would form a loyal population that might prove a permanent bulwark against future aggression and domestic treason. Thus, these Scotch emigrants obtained the name of Scotch-Irish, though except in occasional instances, without any mixture of blood. Indeed, it was the great object of the king to prevent this, and it was upon the mutual antipathies of the two races that he relied for the success of his scheme. I think it's very interesting to see how that definition played out 100 to 150 years ago compared to today, when it's still in flux and trying to be defined. We have a nice map here that's showing the reverse migration the first map.
John,
Yes,
John, we're not seeing, the only thing we're seeing since you put up a new image a few minutes ago is Indigenous peoples and some other folks sitting near a fire, and it says squid makes a speech.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna stop
all right,
sharing.
so let me try again. What am I doing wrong here?
You'll have to share again and then click on what you want to open on your desktop. You're gonna see. That's that. And now you take it and then share your screen. And you scroll up.
What, how do I do that?
Share your screen.
But I gotta get the screen.
Presentation. And click package in there. So you can see that. Should be able to. That's mine.
What are you seeing now, Larissa?
We see sort of your desktop or your, we see multiple images, multiple files. So perhaps if you click on one, I don't know if it would open up and then you can go back and click on another.
Well, that's what I've been doing,
Yeah,
but it's not.
it doesn't advance. It doesn't advance through. We don't see it advance. I would say give it another minute or so to figure it out. And then if not, I would just go with, just talk through.
Right.
See that.
You seeing my whole desktop now?
Yeah, still see the whole thing.
Are you looking at the map?
We can see multiple
No,
small images.
For some reason it's not showing that.
for some reason it's not sharing my screen. I'm not sure why.
It's not showing the presentation. Oh, it's going to the future.
Still not getting it.
Nope.
All right,
I don't know, John.
so I'm not going to waste time with that.
Yeah. You can send me the images later and I can put it into something that we can send out to the participants.
Do you see the whole display at this point?
Yeah.
All right, well, let me talk that through. I don't know how well it appears on your screen, but it's at least give you some idea of the background. There's a picture of Elijah Kellogg at his church on
Yeah.
the fourth set.
Yeah.
And then there's a picture of the map of Scotland and Ireland showing the immigration back to the north of Ireland.
Yeah.
The next map is a map of New England from that time period. And it's very interesting because I wish I could blow it up and you could see it, but it shows New England being English territory from the Kennebec River to the south. I'm using my cursor to point that out. And then to the east, it shows Acadia being under French claim in the Kennebec River Valley coming down between, and everything to the west being Native American territory. Interestingly enough, of course, that's exactly where Brunswick, Topsham, and Bowdenham currently exist, and where the Scots-Irish were brought, the Ulster-Scots were brought in the 1718 immigration. The next map is a map from the French point of view, which shows that whole area to the east of the Kennebec River as being Wabanaki territory, which is probably more correct, although it was claimed by French at that time. The next photo is indication of how the collapse of the District of Maine took place shortly before the arrival of the Ulster-Scots in 1718, with the Candlemas Massacre and the fall of Fort Boyle in Falmouth, and the whole district basically collapsing under the advance of the French and Indian alliance. So we have what I talk about as instigators and facilitators for the immigration. And one of the great instigators for that immigration was Cotton Mather, who was the head of the Puritan church here in New England, and who had contacts throughout Scotland and England with the Protestant churches. And he wrote letters to them, encouraging the emigration of people of good Protestant faith coming to New England to have, in return for receiving land and becoming a buffer, if you will, between the collapse of the Eastern District of Maine and Massachusetts. Massachusetts was in kind of a panic at that time. Those of you who are familiar with the witch trials are aware of the implications between the collapse of Maine and the paranoia of the witch trials in Salem. Cotton Mather actually wrote a letter to James Woodside, Reverend James Woodside being one of the facilitators. So let's go back a second. We have instigators and facilitators. I call Cotton Mather an instigator because of his promotion of bringing the immigrants over. And we also have the Pejepscot proprietors, which Ian will undoubtedly talk about, and the Kennebec proprietors, all needing and promoting the idea of settlement in this area, either to improve their own investment or to create a buffer for Massachusetts. Cotton Mather wrote a letter to James Woodside in that time period saying that and this was December of 1718, saying how pleased he was that Woodside had brought his congregation over to this area, and that he believed that the Native American population would fail in any attempt to dislodge them because they had a representative of the church as the head of the group. I find that rather ironic after the collapse of the southern Maine area at the Candle Massacre, which also had a minister as their leader, Reverend Dummer, down there at that time. But nonetheless, there was a lot of spin going on and a lot of promotion going on. And Cotton Mather was an instigator, and Reverend Woodside, Reverend McGregor, and Robert Temple were facilitators. The two reverends bringing their congregations and others from that area of the north of Ireland with them in their migration here to acquire land and establish their own churches. And Robert Temple being basically an empire builder himself, for himself, bringing several more boatloads of Scots-Irish immigrants to the area, principally around the Kennebec River and Cork Colony and Merrymeeting Bay, so that by the time of 1722 in the Dummer Wars, the whole area from the Eastern River south along the Kennebec River on both sides into Georgetown had been settled with Scots-Irish people. The next list that we have up there, which I'm sorry I can't share with you in better detail, is a list of the communities that settled on the coast of Maine in that time period from 1718 to 1760. There's over 30 communities that came in with Scots-Irish at that time. There was the push out of Northern Ireland at that time because of religious persecution of the Presbyterian faith, a collapse of the crop failures that were taking place, creating a famine situation. And you also had rent racking, which was going on every 10 years. The rents went up to a point that were unsustainable for those that were renting farmland in the north of Ireland to pay their landlords. So there was a push factor going on in the north of Ireland. There was a pull factor by these facilitators and instigators saying, okay, you're welcome to come here. We have land if you can keep it, if you can hold it. And the Scots-Irish had a reputation for being able to hold their land throughout the troubles that had taken place both in the borders of Scotland and in the north of Ireland. The next map, which I would have shown you, is a map from that time period that shows Brunswick as being, quote, a new Irish settlement. And it shows the fort at Fort George at the falls and the Woodside garrison at McCoy Bay, which are connected by the 12 Rod Road, and the parish, first parish at the center of that distance between those 2 points. Obviously with a scheme of developing the whole area into an urban environment with farmland adjacent, and the parish being the center of the community. Most of you will be familiar with that parish location and the cemetery that's there now near the intersection between Pleasant Hill Road and Main Street. The next photo is a look from Merry Meeting Bay aerial photo down river and all the way to Falmouth, which encompasses most of the area that was settled between 1718 and 1722. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that everything above the Chops and Woolwich area was still claimed entirely by the Native Americans, but Robert Temple was bringing his people in there anyway and settling up, as were some of the Pejepscot proprietors and the Kennebec proprietors. We were able to, Maine Ulster-Scots project was able to locate an original homestead from 1718 in Bodenham and did an excavation there to find out the materials and the lifestyle of the first footprint Scots-Irish family on Merry Meeting Bay, which was subsequently burned out in 1722 during the startup of the Dummer War. Very, very interesting project. The encroachments onto Native American territory is where we're going to leave this off, and that's the photo that you were seeing in the beginning, was the interface between the Scots-Irish settlers and the Native American people and their attempt to resolve the differences, which I'm sure Ian will enlighten you on to a greater extent. And I'm sorry to rush through that so quickly, but there's only so much you can do in 20 minutes, and especially if you can't make your computer work right. So I look forward to your questions at the end of the program, and we will turn it over to Ian.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Larissa, for the kind invitation, and to everybody in the audience for coming. So to begin, I think a point on immigration and colonization, and we should begin by just pointing out that the Ulster-Scots, like everybody else in the English Empire during the early modern period, nobody was moving to an empty area. That from its inception, when the English began colonizing, first in Ireland and then in the Western Hemisphere, they were always going somewhere that somebody else had already claimed. In many cases, multiple people. So there was virtually always a Native American nation living there, but then there were often other rival claims by European powers as well. So for the English Empire and later the British Empire, the act of immigration was always paired with a sort of militarized project as well. And for early modern peoples, the practice of trade and movements and immigration were inseparable from the practice of colonization and military confrontation. Religious activity was blended with violence, commercial activity was blended in violence. And so this was a distinction that we are drawing too fine a line on today. And so that did not begin or end in what's now Maine. And so for the Ulster-Scots, going to Ireland, where somebody already was, and essentially being deployed as shock troops of empire for the English crown, going to Maine was just following on to that history. Okay, so about the people who were already there, I'm gonna bring up here. Okay, I'm gonna slideshow. Here we go. All right. So if we're talking about who's already there, if we're looking at the where the Ulster-Scots went to.
We're not seeing a screen yet. And
oh, sorry. Right. I apologize. I forgot to hit my screen share. Sorry about that. Share screen. There we go. Okay. Boom. All right. Let's go full slideshow. There we go. Okay. So
Great.
If we look at a sort of broader picture of the American Northeast, the folks living in what the English people eventually called Maine were a confederacy by 1700 or so of linguistically and culturally similar peoples. together called the Wabanaki, or people of the Dawnland. And so the folks living closest to where the Ulster-Scots landed near modern day Brunswick were the Amarascoggin and Kennebec. And by the late 1600s, before the Ulster-Scots had arrived, various, usually English colonizers had signed assorted agreements with the Wabanakis living along the coast, for the simple fact that they had to pay for permission to be there. Otherwise, they'd be driven off or killed, because there were still too many Wabanakis there. And so to make a complex issue quick and short, yes, the Wabanakis had a system of property ownership. It was not capitalist in the modern sense of the word. They were not accruing wealth to make a fortune, but in the basic anthropological sense, in that they limited resource use to particular groups of people at different times, like all human societies do. The Wabanakis absolutely collectively had a system of property ownership where they lived for the land and water rights. And they viewed themselves as managing the land in cooperation with other human and otherworldly communities. Much like the Scots-Irish colonizers, the Wabanakis lived in a world powerfully shaped by spiritual forces and power, which they did their best to understand. These agreements, these early 17th century land transactions, some of them were very clearly consensual. Some of them are murky, and we're still sort of figuring out exactly what happened. And a few of them were very much fraudulent and not consensual. And so the most important land transaction for our purposes, I didn't include it on the slides because it just doesn't look as good, was known as the Deed of the Six Sagamores, signed with Richard Wharton in 1684. That was the basis of the Pejepscot proprietors' land claim in modern day Brunswick. And so by the time the Ulster-Scots arrived in the late 1710s, the Pejepscot proprietors' claim that they had hoped to make a reality was this sort of dark shaded area on this map. There were several other land speculator claims that were attempted to be put in force by the early 18th century. And I'd like to point out, though, that by the early 18th century, there were a handful of now British towns. The circles on this map, we see Brunswick and Topsham there. The major Wabanaki villages, which they lived in for part of the year, and then the other part of the year they fished or hunted elsewhere. The major villages that the Wabanaki communities gathered in were somewhat further upriver. This was very explicitly, in part, by this point, because they were well aware that the British colonists, they did not make for the best of neighbors in terms of mutual land uses. Long story short, British farmers, they let their pigs and other livestock run wild. It tended to make the surrounding landscape less useful for supporting deer and other game that the Wabanakis hunted. They also farmed, but they hunted for part of their calories as well. The British also tended to set up weirs and other traps and dams in the rivers that had a negative long-term impact on the sustainability of these waterways for maintaining a healthy fish population. So by the early 18th century, the Wabanakis had very clearly figured out that allowing the British to move next door was bad for property values, if you will. And so they stopped selling new lands to the British colonists. Now, in 1722, a war broke out that we don't have a good name for, but it's most commonly known as Dummer's War. A war broke out between the Wabanakis and the province of Massachusetts, which claimed Maine until it administered Maine until 1820. This was largely over different interpretations of some of these older land deeds and treaties that had ended earlier wars. And again, to make a complicated issue simple, the British, who were at this point, their government policy was heavily run by these large land companies who mostly lived in Boston and played a major role in Massachusetts government. They argued that in resettling, quote, old claims formerly settled, what they meant by this, what the British understood this to mean was all the, even the most vague land patents that the Native Americans had rejected were going to put towns on. The Wabanakis understood this to mean that you can rebuild towns abandoned in previous wars. And so when the Pejepscot proprietors founded the new town of Brunswick, the Emeritas and Kennebecs resisted. And then that eventually led to war in 1722 that lasted until 1727. The upshot of this conflict, known as Dummer's War, was the destruction of the town of Brunswick in 1722. Also, for our purposes, a lot of the towns, they're not even full towns, but a lot of the areas built up by the Ulster-Scots in the run-up to Dummer's War, these areas were destroyed and abandoned, at least temporarily. So the town of Cork, there's still certain amounts of debate about where it was, because Cork was abandoned in Dummer's War and it was not fully reoccupied after the conflict. So too with several of these other smaller establishments of Ulster-Scots. And what happened is this began a pattern that continued into the 1750s of periodic investors would say, speculators would say that we have good title to this land. They would invite a bunch of colonists over from Europe, Ulster-Scots often, but then sometimes Germans and others. These people would move to a given area, and then the local indigenous people would tell them, wait a minute, we never said anybody could come here. What are you doing here? And then chaos, disagreements, and often violence would ensue. And so Dummer's War was the first of several of these. And the Ulster-Scots, periodically, some of the folks who arrived with Temple in 1718, some of them eventually popped up further along the coast, over in this hashed area that's labeled as Dunbar's incursion from the 1720s and 30s. And then some of these folks eventually moved to Waldo's claim, the Muscongas claim over by Fort St. George's in the 1730s. And then some of these people were still in the vicinity of the mid-Maine coast by the 1750s. And so these were in that sense a hard luck bunch. That said, they also were oftentimes very much the folks who enlisted in Maine militia to go to war against the Wabanakis. Okay, so the upshot of Dummer's War is that the Wabanakis and Massachusetts signed an agreement known as Dummer's Treaty. Hang on, I'm just checking my time here. Okay, they signed an agreement known as Dummer's Treaty, in which effectively the Wabanakis drew a line slightly north of present-day Richmond, and they agreed to acknowledge land deeds along the coast of Maine as long as the Massachusetts authorities promised to disavow, and this was the quotation in the Dummer's Treaty, to disavow all other deeds that the Wabanakis had not acknowledged, and that they would not try and colonize lands not legally sold. And so this agreement led to a sort of a détente for about 20 years. Now, both the Wabanakis and the Ulster-Scots did not forget this, forget about the bloodshed in the wars. There was a good deal of of memories and anger from the fighting. One of the best, one of my favorite items in the Maine Historical Society is a petition from the residents of Brunswick and Topsham, including a number of the Ulster-Scots families, when the province of Massachusetts was going to abandon one of the forts outside of Brunswick. It was called Fort George. This is different than Fort St. George. They really needed new names for these things. This other fort was also known as Fort Brunswick. And the residents of Brunswick wrote a petition in which read in part, they said, where we live has from time out of mind been a meeting ground for savage people who view us as trespassers on their land. And they view themselves as still holding all the rights to fish and fowl and hunt wherever they want. And of course, if you read the text of the deed from the Six Sagamores and others, it very much reserves to the Wabanakis rights to fish and hunt and catch birds in this area. And so very much the Wabanakis were holding residence to these agreements. And so this another confrontation between local Ulster-Scots and the Wabanakis occurred at St. George in 1735, when another speculator, Samuel Waldo, tried to pull a similar stunt, where he, in this case, he had a land claim based on a never acknowledged deed by the Wabanakis. In this case, the province of Massachusetts actually sided with the Wabanakis in this case. But because we're running short on time, I'm gonna move on here. A few points. One thing is that I would argue that the Ulster-Scots role in the fighting against the Wabanakis was undoubtedly important. But it's important to note that the Ulster-Scot colonists weren't any more aggressive or anti-Indian than the English neighbors of theirs either. And so we see colonial Mainers taking out participating in scalp hunts in the wars against the Wabanakis, sponsored by Massachusetts, where they were issued bounties of, by the 1750s, 300 pounds sterling for the scalp of any man, woman, or child above the age of 12. And the Ulster-Scots are sometimes held up in a sort of ethnic essentialist way of being warlike or something like that in sort of very reductionist terms. And I think that distorts the fact that it's pretty much all the British colonists in Maine participated in these. And the Harvard graduate minister of the First Church of Falmouth, present-day Portland, a Congregationalist, not in any way Ulster-Scots gathering, he sponsored scalp hunters in the 1750s, and he collected on his investments. And we know this because of his diary. But it is also true that the history of the Ulster-Scots relations with the Wabanakis in Maine in the 18th century, the most memorable encounters between them, especially from the Wabanaki perspective, were battles and sometimes massacres. And so the most noteworthy last one being the Owl's Head Massacre, in which James Cargill, an Ulster-Scots migrant, led a band of scalp hunters, unauthorized, I should add, that ambushed and slaughtered a party of Pejepscot diplomats on the way home from a parley at Fort St. George in 1755, which ended up being really the precipitating incident, encouraging the Penobscots to join the wider 7 Years' War on the frontier. Okay, so I am going to the last thought that I'm going to end with here is that by the end of the 18th century wars in the 1750s, Massachusetts didn't sign any peace treaties with the Wabanakis, and instead they were told by Governor Pownall that we won, you lost, and that we will allow you essentially to exist on sufferance of Massachusetts colony. And this was this peace treaty. It did not mean the end of Wabanaki presence in Maine or anything like that, but it did in fact encourage the Wabanakis to side with the United States against British authorities in the hopes of eventually renewing regular relations with Massachusetts, as they hoped. All right, I will stop there, stop my screen share. All right.
Ian, thank you very much. And John, that's great. I think we would love to have a few questions. We do have a couple things in the chat box now, but I encourage folks to add some questions to the chat box while we have these two gentlemen very knowledgeable with us. I want to start with actually a great question for many of us, including those of us who have research services here. Can the presenters suggest a short bibliography on the subject of the Ulster-Scots in this region? And I'm sure for others, others on the presentation today may have suggestions, but may be also interested in this question.
A short bibliography is probably going to be hard to find. There are lots of source materials, but the most recent compilation of information was done in 2018 and is called Reflections, 1718-2018, Reflections on 300 Years of the Scots-Irish in Maine. You can see that backwards, forwards. It is available through our website, Maine Ulster-Scots Project.com website. And it's a really good place to start. And if it doesn't give you the specific information you're looking for, it certainly has references to the source materials that you may be able to use. And it's the best compilation of information that I know of on the subject of the Ulster-Scots in Maine.
Ian, do you have some thoughts about reading that people might want to do?
Sure. I defer to John on the Ulster-Scots. I mean, the best, I would say that the best big book on them is Patrick Griffin's The People with No Name, that talks about their story on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. But so my recommendations would be more along the lines of other aspects of colonial Maine or Wabanaki history. Do you have one or two favorites you could suggest in that? Or hang on, I gotta double check on the title here. So I don't want to just be a heel and recommend my own book, Properties of Empire, although it is about indigenous and colonial ideas of property in Maine. Kenneth Morrison, I'm trying to think. Kenneth Morrison. A good diplomatic history is Kenneth Morrison's The Elusive Ideal of Alliance in Abenaki Euro-American Relations. That's a classic. I would recommend a really good starter is Bruce Bork's 10,000 Years, the indigenous history in Maine. It's wonderfully illustrated. Heavy use of great archaeological sources as well. So those are some excellent starting points.
Shout out for Bruce today, who's on the presentation. I can see him right now. Awesome, thank you. Okay, we have some other good questions here. Tell us more about the Scots-Irish settlers themselves. What did they expect to find in Maine? How were they recruited? Did they have to pay for their transatlantic passage, or were they paid to come? Did they all expect to be farmers?
So I can speak to a bit of this and then turn things to John. I would say, first of all, one of the advantages to bringing Ulster Scots for a lot of the speculators is some of them, like Waldo, they thought that the Europeans would be more willing to be tenants and that they would actually stay on their lands and not expect a freehold, which was what most New England colonists had come to expect. In other words, you own your land free and clear. And so these people, some of them were indentured to come over. in sense they signed a contract and they promised to stay for a set amount of time on their sponsor's land. The overwhelming majority of them did hope to farm. For the Ulster-Scots, along with most other British people, the economic ideal was competence. In other words, you own enough land to support yourself and your family, and that you don't have to work for somebody else. And you don't have to be a tenant, and you don't have to be a hireling or an employee. And so for the Ulster-Scots, the most frequent disappointment was if they didn't have enough land to do that, or if they weren't able to obtain that level of competency, or if in fact there wasn't enough good land to go around. And some of them were definitely told embellished tales about just how verdant and wonderful Maine was compared to where they were from. That did not always pan out.
It's a good question and an interesting subject, and it's always more complicated than you think. The emigration from north of Ireland to America took place over a long period of time, and different promoters used different methods. And economic situations of the people coming over were different during the different time periods. For example, the first to arrive in 1718 had the advantage of having their rents in Northern Ireland still being of some value to sell or transfer to other parties and bring that capital with them from the sale of that interest, and use that money to get established here. Later immigrants into the 1740s, when the economy in the north of Ireland had collapsed more, there was no real estate value to transmit to the New World, and we're under different circumstances. Plus, every group that came over was working within a different bunch of people. You had the people that came with Reverend McGregor had different circumstances, perhaps, than some of the ones that came with Temple, and certainly some different circumstances depending on where they landed. Further east in Maine, as Ian has indicated, there was the intention that they would be renters. But the ones that came earlier had every intention of owning property outright and getting away from the rent system, which had been onerous to them for generations. So it's not a simple answer. It's a complicated answer. And you've got to look at the groups as they came across and where they came from in the time period they came to get a feel for it.
Great, thank you.
I've often said that the first group seemed to be more literate. They signed their names and had an education, had money in their pockets, often bought their land outright. Later groups had to compromise and find other ways of indenture or whatever to afford to come over. And yes, they had to buy the passage was not paid for them.
We have a question here. How did the 18th century conflicts in Maine contribute to the witch trials in Massachusetts?
They very much did indirectly. By the witch trials in Massachusetts were kind of a perfect storm. The colony of Massachusetts was without a charter at the time that they started. And so that's like a combination of a permission slip for a colony to exist and the set of legal rules. But the Salem and Essex County in general was full of refugees from the fighting on the frontier. And many of the accusers and accused were themselves refugee Mainers, or new people, or knew each other from their time on the frontier. So there's not like a one-to-one causality, of any cause, but certainly that was a major factor, amping up everybody's fear. And also, it's important to note that in talking of refugees, as Larissa did at the beginning of this, that Salem was very much a refugee center in 1692, which led to its own, tensions.
Interesting. Thank you. I think one more question here. Could you briefly comment on whether these patterns of Ulster-Scot settlement in Maine in the early 1700s were repeated elsewhere in New England, such as in New Hampshire?
the New Hampshire group, the first New Hampshire group coming into what was Nutfield, then later called Londonderry, and then spreading out from there, actually arrived at the same time. Many of them came to Casco Bay first before they went to New Hampshire. So it's basically the same group to a large extent, although there's a lot of discussion going around the idea of congregations, and Reverend McGregor's group went to New Hampshire, Reverend Woodside's group stayed in Maine, but there are also individuals within those transports, if you will, that did not seem to be part of the congregation, but it came of their own accord and spread out, not sticking with either Woodside or McGregor. So New Hampshire, yes, was basically set up on the same pattern in the same time period as was Worcester, Massachusetts. And if you take Boston and draw a 100-mile arc around Massachusetts from there, you get an idea of where the Ulster-Scots were established in order to form a perimeter around that group. But of course, as Ian has indicated, there's an old saying that Scots-Irish weren't happy until they moved 3 times. You try to follow this group around, you see Mainers going back to New Hampshire and then coming back again after trouble settled down, and then moving further east into Waldo's group, and then further east. They tended to move a lot, and certainly even more so the ones that came into Philadelphia down the Great Wagon Road and established the Scots-Irish trails down through there. They were looking for land and they were looking for opportunity, and most of them were not looking to rent. They were looking to own property. Land was a big part of their impetus.
Great. Somebody just mentioned that The Devil of Great Island by Emerson Baker is a good look at the witchcraft/war nexus. So I wanted to point that out if you hadn't seen that in the chat box. And one last quick thing, and then we are going to end, and that is that somebody asked about the Woodside garrison, whether that has been located. And John, can you just, you had answered that question and said yes, where that has been found, and could you just expand on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of the gentleman in Brunswick that did the archaeological dig. Maybe Bruce can give me that name. They did find the footprint of that building in at the end of the McCoy Road on the east side of the road, up on a little hill. And I'd love to give you the name of the gentleman that led that group, but I can't think of it right this minute.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, Bruce, do you know?
I don't. At least I don't know the site by that name.
Okay.
Fred Kerber.
Fred.
Yes, Fred Kerber. Thank you. That's
Fred
correct.
would know. Fred was supposed to be on today, but I don't think he is.
I didn't
So
make
if we-
it.
Fred's the one that led that investigation and has the information on it.
All right. I think that we are, yep, Fred did that dig. Okay. So thank you very much to both of you for that presentation. We really, really appreciate that. It's obviously hugely historically important for our area to understand that history. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. What a great turnout. Now you can go enjoy a little bit of this nice, sunny, slightly warmer day than we've had recently. And I hope we see you at a future program very soon. So take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.